2017. Phoenix, Arizona. A woman lying motionless in a yard, the stillness around her unnaturally complete. Patrol lights cut through the dim, catching dust in suspended fragments, revealing the outline of Seleana Escobedo, 31 years old, critically wounded by a single gunshot. No witnesses, no vehicle sounds reported, no struggle heard through the thin October air. Within minutes, she is taken from the yard that became her final known place of breath, disappearing into the fluorescent corridors of an emergency room where she will not survive. And the questions begin quietly, almost reluctantly, about how she came to be there, and why no one saw the moment that ended her life. In a case buried by silence, your attention becomes part of the record and archive the algorithm can't suppress. Stay with this story and allow the investigation to reach you. Even now, the desert still holds its breath. Subscribe to follow the evidence as we begin. The first responding officers arrived at approximately 5:45 a.m., guided only by the original caller's uncertain tone, someone reporting a body that might still be alive. The neighborhood was an unremarkable patch of Phoenix sprawl. Low fences, gravel yards, porch lights left on overnight. Nothing in the setting suggested the final stage of a homicide. Yet the curvature of Seleana's posture, the faint warmth beneath her skin, and the shallow rise of her chest indicated a rapidly closing window. Emergency medical technicians stabilized her briefly before rushing her toward the nearest hospital, but the damage was already irreversible. She succumbed shortly after arrival. In these early hours, investigators followed a predictable pattern: cordon, document, identify. But the scene resisted clarity. There were no shell casings in the immediate radius, no obvious blood trail leading in or out of the yard, no defensive markings indicating a struggle had occurred on site. Her location suggested she either collapsed where she was shot or had been moved, but neither conclusion aligned cleanly with the physical evidence. Even the yard itself, with its scattered decorative stones and sparse desert plants, showed no disruption. Detectives canvassed nearby houses, knocking on doors still locked against the morning light. Residents reported nothing unusual: no shouts, no impact sounds, no vehicles accelerating away. One neighbor mentioned a dog barking briefly around the same time, but the detail was vague, easily attributed to any number of passing movements in the early hours. By mid-morning, investigators expanded the radius, checking for discarded items, tire impressions, or any sign that Seleana had attempted to seek help before collapsing. The results returned empty. By noon, her identity had been confirmed through standard procedures, and the weight of the case settled into its first difficult reality. Very little was known about her final hours. No timeline could be constructed with certainty. Phone records were requested. Preliminary autopsy planning began. But without witnesses or physical anchors, the investigation had already entered a state of suspension. Inside the precinct's homicide unit, the case file, thin and prematurely quiet, began its life on a shelf, already crowded with unanswered stories from across the city. The lead detectives noted the lack of media attention. No press conferences were scheduled. No extended interviews were requested. A homicide without narrative momentum gathers dust quickly, and for Seleana, this would become one of the defining obstacles of her case. But at the hospital, medical staff provided the final clinical details: a single gunshot wound, trajectory consistent with close to moderate range, rapid onset of catastrophic internal damage, no additional injuries, no signs of restraint, no drugs or alcohol detected in the preliminary toxicology sweep. Her last moments remained medically understood but contextually blank. Investigators returned to the scene before dusk, hoping the evening light might reveal details overlooked in the glare of morning. They conducted secondary sweeps along alleyways and drainage paths. The silence around the neighborhood remained undisturbed, the homes returning to their routine. Nothing new surfaced. If you're watching this, pause for a moment and tell us, what would you examine next? Your perspective becomes part of the inquiry as we continue to rebuild the fragments of an erased moment. As detectives moved into the second week of the investigation, the absence of foundational evidence began to create a vacuum in the timeline. Without witnesses, surveillance, or clear scene indicators, investigators relied on secondary data: radio logs, officer movement reports, environmental patterns to reconstruct a morning that refused to align. It was during these reviews that small irregularities began to stand out, not as conclusions, but as fractures in the expected sequence of events. One of the earliest points of confusion came from the initial dispatch audio. The original caller's report was brief, but officers noted a faint distortion threaded beneath the voice. Static interference uncommon for standard urban transmissions. It was dismissed at first as an artifact of the recording system, yet later checks revealed no documented malfunctions during that time frame. The static appeared only on that specific call, beginning just as the caller described seeing someone lying there, and ending the moment the call disconnected. Nothing about it altered the course of the case, but it added a subtle irregularity to an already thin narrative. When field teams returned to the neighborhood days later, they experienced another anomaly: not dramatic, but persistent minor compass drift on handheld devices. The deviation was small, only a few degrees off true north. and disappeared once they left a radius of approximately 2 blocks around the yard where Seleana was found. Environmental explanations were considered: underground metal deposits, buried utility infrastructure, even nearby cell towers. None provided a consistent cause. The drift wasn't extreme enough to hinder the investigation, but it was documented because, in a case with so few leads, every deviation mattered. Crime scene technicians also revisited the decorative gravel where Seleana had been discovered. In cases of collapse or movement, displaced stone often offers directional clues: a scuff, a drag, a pressure line. But the gravel here showed only intermittent compression, inconsistent with the weight distribution of a falling body. Some impressions aligned with parametric activity. Others seemed to predate their arrival by hours. The technicians could not determine whether Seleana had walked into the yard or been placed there, nor whether she had crossed the gravel at all. There were no shoe prints attributable to her, no clear tread marks, only the faint patterning of small disturbances with no assignable source. Farther along the street, a set of partial impressions, shallow, almost translucent in the dust, formed a short trail leading toward a side alley. Officers initially considered them possible footprints. Their spacing matched a slow, uneven gait, but the impressions faded abruptly after only a few yards, ending before any identifiable direction emerged. The material of the dust made it difficult to analyze, too fine for clear casting, too disturbed for consistent measurement. Whether they belonged to Seleana or an unrelated movement remained impossible to confirm. The more detectives attempted to stitch the environment back together, the more the morning resisted reconstruction. A neighbor's security camera, aimed toward the street, failed to record any footage from 5:30 to 6 a.m. The homeowner reported periodic outages, but could not recall a failure during that specific window. Another resident mentioned hearing an engine idling sometime before dawn, but could not specify the direction, distance, or duration. These fragments existed as isolated signals unanchored, UNRESOLVABL. By the third week, investigators had mapped every realistic route leading toward the yard. None provided clarity. No abandoned vehicle reports matched a potential timeline. No stray projectiles were found in adjacent properties. Even acoustic modeling produced no obvious conclusions. The neighborhood layout suggested that a gunshot at close range should have been audible beyond at least 2 houses, yet no one recalled hearing anything distinguishable from ordinary nighttime noise. The case began to feel suspended in a corridor of incomplete sensory impressions: footsteps that dissolved, static that shouldn't exist, devices that drifted, and a yard that held no trace of the moment it should have captured. If you're here with us, allow this investigation to keep unfolding. Your engagement keeps the case from fading further. Like this video to support the continuation of the search. In the weeks that followed, detectives attempted to build a more complete portrait of Seleana Escobedo, task made difficult by the limited information available and the lack of widespread coverage at the time of her death. The investigators who met with her family described a quiet, understated grief, a mourning shaped not only by loss, but by the emptiness left behind when the questions outnumber the answers. They offered what little they could: memories, fragments, photographs, but the narrative remained sparse, as if her life had already begun slipping from public memory long before the file grew cold. Her relatives recalled her as someone who moved through life with a certain reserve, preferring small, familiar circles. She lived without drawing attention, rarely inserting herself into conflict, and keeping her personal matters close. Yet she was dependable and subtle, consistent ways, an unspoken presence at family gatherings, someone who checked in when illness or difficulty surfaced. These recollections came not with dramatic flourishes, but with a quiet steadiness that reflected the way she had navigated that world. Detectives traced her movements in the weeks leading up to October 2017 using digital records, phone logs, and informal statements from acquaintances. Nothing indicated volatility or danger. There were no escalating disputes, no recent threats, no patterns that suggested she had been targeted. Much of her recorded activities suggested ordinary routines: short errands, work-related communications, messages exchanged with relatives. Her final evening showed no red flags, no calls suggesting distress, no sudden shift in tone or movement. The absence of warning signs created an additional layer of difficulty, as unpredictable incidents leave fewer patterns for investigators to follow. Her personal belongings, collected from the hospital, as well as those found on her at the time, offered little insight. A phone without recent unusual activity, a small amount of cash, identification, items consistent with someone moving through an ordinary morning or late-night hours. Though detectives could not determine why she was in that specific neighborhood, she had no listed contacts there, no known obligations nearby, and no evidence placing her in that area in the days prior. The emotional weight of the case grew heavier, not because of dramatic revelations, but because of the absence of them. Families often find solace in at least understanding the framework of their loved one's final moments, even when the answers are painful. Here, that structure was missing. Statements collected from family members carried a recurring theme: she deserved more attention than her case received, more clarity than silence, more recognition than a few understated reports that faded quickly from public view. Detectives, revisiting the early phase of the investigation, noted that this lack of external pressure, a byproduct of minimal media engagement, allowed the case to drift before a foundation had even formed. Leads that might have surfaced within the first 48 hours never materialized. Tips that might have emerged from a broader audience were never given the chance. The file grew quiet too quickly, and once a case enters a quiet stage, reactivation requires either new evidence or the rare persistence of those unwilling to let it vanish entirely. Within the walls of the Cold Case Unit, her name remains one of many, yet those who reviewed her file described an unusual stillness to it, a kind of structural emptiness that makes reconstruction difficult. A life documented in thin fragments, a death documented in thin fragments, a morning that refuses to assemble into sequence. And still, the question presses forward, patient and unchanged: who brought her to that yard? And why did no one see the moment her life was taken? In the years since that October morning, Seleana Escobedo's case has settled into the quiet space reserved for unanswered stories. Files that remain intact not because they are close to resolution, but because they continue to resist it. Detectives reviewing the evidence describe the same sensation, a timeline that feels present but unreachable, as though the morning itself has thinned around the facts. Her final moments remain defined not by clarity but by the absence of it. The yard where she was found has changed. The gravel has been replaced, the plants rearranged, the fence repainted. Yet residents still recall the way police lights fractured the dawn that day, illuminating a moment the neighborhood cannot explain. Investigators continue to work her case when new methods emerge, though each revisit leads back to the same narrow corridor: one life, one wound, one location, and no traceable origin. Some cases fade because they are overshadowed. Others linger because they leave too few anchors to interpret. Seleana's belongs to the latter, a narrative made of missing pieces, a silence that grows heavier each year. It remains unbroken. If you've stayed with this story until now, allow your presence to help preserve it. Subscribe to ensure her name does not drift further from the record. In the end, the unanswered question remains untouched, steady as ever beneath the shifting years. How did she arrive in that yard, and who walked away unseen?